Welcome to the Self-Publishing School podcast. This is the podcast to listen to if you're an aspiring writer or an author who wants to be more successful. On this show, you'll learn how to write and launch a book successfully, all from the top authors and people just like you who are doing it at the highest level. I'm your host, Chandler Bolt, the founder of Self-Publishing School, the author of the book called Published, and the CEO of selfpublishing.com. For free training on how to publish a book that sells 10,000 copies, go to selfpublishing.com/free training. Hey, Chandler Bolt here, and joining me today is Kristina Stanley. Kristina is the founder and CEO of Fictionary. Fictionary helps writers and editors create better stories faster with software and online community, editing services, and editing courses. She's the author of multiple books, including, both fiction and nonfiction. So fiction books, Descent, Blaze, and other books. And then her most recent book, Secrets to Editing Success. So today we're going to talk a little bit about editing, fiction editing, Fictionary. What is it? How can it help with the process? A bunch of different stuff. So should be a good one. Kristina, great to have you here.
Oh, Chandler, I'm very excited. Thank you for hosting this. And it's really a pleasure to meet you in person. I kind of fangirling just a little bit here, that I'm a little nervous, very excited to talk to you and also to talk about Fictionary, of course.
Well, hey, we've had many conversations. This is the first one in person. That's how I always feel with all the video content or podcast content. So I guess first things first, like why books? Why are they such a huge part of your life and your business?
Yeah. Okay. So like everybody, books, reading, passion, love it. Read all my life, all kinds of things. And, one day I decided I was going to write a book. How hard could that be? Yep. We all know it's really, really hard. So I kind of jumped into the whole book industry through writing books. And through that, I discovered what I really love is editing, and editing from a structural perspective, not copy editing, grammar, punctuation, but story editing and figuring out the puzzle of a story. It's kind of like brain candy. And so, being able to combine love of reading with running a business is just unbelievable how great it is.
So talk to me about, because I know for people like you and I mean, we're in this every day, but you talked about editing from a structure perspective and not just like copy editing, grammar. In your view, what are the different types of editing and how are they different?
Sure. Yeah. So I started this because when I first started writing, there's all these terms about editing, right? And you think, what is substantive editing? What is line edit? What are all these things? I don't know what these things are. It drove me crazy. And so because I'm focused on fiction, we decided to call it story editing. So it's structural editing of a novel. So focused on fiction, but it's the structure of the story. And so our belief is no matter what you write in a novel, if you don't have a story, it's not going to sell. People aren't going to love it. You're not going to get great reviews. You need to have a really strong story that readers love. And so we edit from the perspective of having a story readers love. And then behind that comes the different types of editing. And so line editing comes next. And that's where really that's just a heavy duty copy edit where it's not just punctuation and grammar. It's also phrasing and word choice and positioning of paragraphs and sentences and sentence lengths. And it's the most in-depth copy edit. Next comes copy editing, which is really focused on you're looking at, do you have all your sentence structures proper? Is your dialogue formatted properly? Really looking for grammatical errors and typos and things. Then your book gets formatted, ready to go, and then it's proofread. And that's just the very last thing of somebody going, all right, is there an extra space? Are all the capitalizations the same? You write down, you're not making any changes anymore. You're really trying to fix just critical things that must be fixed before publication.
That's good. And I like that distinction. And I agree. There's a bajillion different names that people call editing. Right. And for me, I've always just like simplified as like content and copy, like just like kind of big picture. And so it sounds like our kind of methodologies are pretty similar. And I like making things simple, which it sounds like we have that in common. So you've got one of your newest books is Secrets to Editing Success. I assume Oh, look at that. That's a
Yeah.
great cover.
Thank
Is that
you.
a hardback or paperback?
It's a paperback. It's trade
Cool.
paperback. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that looks fantastic.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming some of what you just talked about is on that list, but what are the secrets to editing success?
So here's the secret. The biggest thing about editing a story is how do you answer the question, do you have a story? Right? Like it seems really fundamental. Of course, I have a draft, but do you actually have a story? So we have a thing called a story test. And what that is, it takes the blurb and we take the blurb and we make it into something really simple. Who's the protagonist? What's at stake? And what's their goal? Three things. That's it. And so when you're editing, you're always looking at every scene and going, all right, who's the protagonist? What are they trying to do? And what's at stake if they fail? Don't have to fail. Some books they do, some books they don't. But what if they do? What's at stake? Because there comes the reader worry. So when you focus your edit just around that, already you're really looking at, am I headed for the story I think I want to write? And then what we advise people to do is to do the story test. And this is to take that blurb and then follow it with, you pull out your scenes from your story of what's the story arc, the 5 key story arc scenes. So what's the inciting incident in the story? What's plot point 1? What's the midpoint, plot point 2, and the climax? And are they all in the right place generally? And are they doing the things they need to do for those 5 key scenes? If the answer is yes, great, start your scene by scene edit. If the answer is no, and I'll give you an example of what a no would be. So when you write your story blurb and you say, okay, we'll use a murder mystery and Mr. Detective has to find killer of a person, whatever. Otherwise, the killer will continue to kill people. Very simple. And what happens quite often with a newer writer is in the climax scene, they have a climax scene, but it doesn't answer that question. So there's no story yet. Haven't answered the story goal yet. And if that's not answered, there is no story yet. Must be answered first. And once that's sorted at a high level, then you can start and go to a scene by scene edit. And if writers follow that when they have their draft, they can see really clearly that, hey, I have an inciting incident, but it's not related to my plot. Not part of the story. Got to change.
Hey, Chandler Bolt here. I hope you're loving this episode so far. It's time to go from inspiration to implementation. All right, so if you've learned something, we want to help you implement what you've learned with your book. So what I want you to do right now is go to selfpublishing.com/schedule, book a publishing consultation with one of the experts on my team. We'll talk about your goals for your book, your dreams, your challenges, your next steps, and we'll start putting together a plan. All right, so go to selfpublishing.com/schedule, book a call with the team. Let's see how we can help with your book. It's time to implement. Now, I think this brings up a question for me and probably a lot of authors wonder this, is how much of this editing needs to live with the author and how much of this editing needs to live with the editor? Because I think that's like the blurriest line of content editing, right? Some of this is just, hey, you need to write a better story and use these principles. And then some of this is, hey, as an editor, I can make this story better. So where do you see as kind of the lines there, and then just good rule of thumbs for people to follow?
Okay, so that's a really great question. So as the writer, it's your story. You own it. The editor can make suggestions, but they don't make changes, right? In copy editing, they would make changes. They'll suggest track changes. You might even do one where they accept them too, so you just get the end product. But in a story edit, the writer is the artist and the editor is the suggester, and that's it. I firmly believe that a writer should do a comprehensive story edit on their own story first, so that when they're working with an editor, they understand what the editor is saying, why they're saying it, and do they want to accept that advice or not? Because if you're not coming from a place of knowledge, there's a tendency to go, you're an editor, of course, and I'll change the story. Well, maybe it's not the right thing for the story. And so there's a fine line. And when an editor is looking at their own story, so they're going to do an edit and then they're going to revise it. An editor is only going to do an edit with suggested edits. So they're on two sides, and it's it's a pretty special relationship. If you find the right editor, Great. There's lots of writers who don't use an editor. They self-edit and go through the whole process and have fantastic books. Great too. And I think as a writer, you have to know yourself and what your capabilities are. Whether do you need a professional editor? Can you do this on their own? Maybe you just need a copy editor, or maybe you need a story editor, but not a copy editor because your prose is so good and you're perfect at it. Great. So it's kind of a little bit different depending on who's writing the book.
That's a good distinction. How do you, I guess the follow-up there would be, how do you know as an author what you need? And any kind of just general advice that's kind of a best practice for people who are writing and publishing their first book?
So best practice, I would go and look at what is a story arc and do you have it in your book? And if you don't, figure it out. Or you could at that point go to a story coach and get them to help you figure it out before you even have an edit. It depends on your financial capabilities and whether you can do that or not. So there's all kinds of ranges, but and part of the reason we developed Fictionary is so there's a tool where you can see your story and it draws the story arc for you and you can see it if it's in the right place or not the right place or it doesn't exist. And so you can know from a writing point of view, do you have a story? And then at that point, a good editor will tell you, you're too soon for me, or you don't need me, you need this type of editing. And even if you have a story edit, a good editor will tell you, you don't need a copy edit, go straight to proofread, or you do need a copy edit, and here's why, kind of thing. And so you really want to investigate your editor and make sure you have someone who has your best interests of art at heart of who you are.
Cool. That's good. You talked about, kind of your copy editing, your content editing, story editing, all that stuff. And how depending on how skilled you are as an author, you might need one, both, some edit themselves. I mean, that seems kind of crazy to me. I know a lot of people do it, especially if you're really advanced. It's like, I can't imagine publishing a book without at least a proofreader or editor. Yep. But then again, I don't consider myself to be like as strong of a writer naturally as probably a lot of people. I mean, and so I lean on my editors a lot. And so can you talk about like, how do you know what type of editing that you need? And then, I guess that would be the first question. I don't want to lead the witness here, but would you say like, hey, when in doubt, you should probably at least get content editing on your first book, or like how do you know what you need? And then what's a good rule of thumb?
So what we've done with Fictionary, there's a lot of people who just can't afford an editor, right? It's really difficult. So you think, all right, so of course, if you can afford a content story editor, hire a good one. It's only going to make your book better, right? But the problem comes with, that's $2,000 to $3,000, and for a first-time author, that could be a lot of money, right? So what we did in our community is we have live events taught by our Fictionary certified story coach editors on how to edit your book. But what we do is we take people's books live and edit live. And so other authors can learn like, oh, that's how I look at my scene. That's what I need in a scene. I need an entry hook, for example. What questions are the readers asking at the beginning of a scene that's going to make them want to read the scene? And what's the exit hook? What's making them go to the next scene? And so we do really specific free training for writers so that they can see us editing live on real people's work, who are very brave to put their work up there because they don't know what we're going to say.
My gosh, yeah.
We just get their stuff, and so it's a really fun thing. It's great for the author because they get a free edit of their first scene. Yeah. But it's also great for people watching. And if you have trusted beta readers, you can go to those people. If you're in a writing circle, you can go to those people. The caveat is make sure they, one, love your genre, because somebody who loves thrillers is not really a great reader of a romance, perhaps, right? You want to find somebody who understands what you're trying to do with your book and has some knowledge behind it. Mm-hmm. If you can have any kind of expert look at a piece of your work to give you an assessment, also really valuable. You see it from a professional's point of view of here's where you're at in your writing, because it's very hard to self-assess, right? Of course, you write your own thing, you're like, oh, that's good, I wrote it. Well, maybe not, but I wrote it, so I think it's good.
Yeah. So you talked about that live edit. That's a really cool process. Also very vulnerable, right? And so I think that brings up a question for me, and we see this all the time with our authors, just kind of battling through this the editing phase. What's your advice for authors on like how do you navigate the editing process and keep your sanity, keep positive? I mean, it can just be demoralizing. And scary. It's like a lot of times people are like, hey, am I ready to send this off to a professional editor? Like that feels like a big step. Any kind of mindset tips for people who are walking that editing process?
Yeah. So here's a really interesting way to keep yourself motivated. Whether you get a professional editor to do your first scene for you, whether you have a friend, a beta reader, whatever it is, typically when we're asking for feedback, we're really saying, what's wrong with this? But if people tell you what they love about it, then you go, oh, I'm actually good at this part. I need to work on this part. And you get motivated from it. And so it's really important. So our philosophy at Fictionary is you edit from a place of kindness. And kindness doesn't mean avoiding problems. Kindness means expressing it in a way that's helpful to the writer. It's harder to do that than to go, I don't really like that. It's much harder to go, all right, here's what worked and here's why. In this case, here's what didn't work and here's why. And so the writer can really see it. And so we're finding that writers are getting motivated when they're getting both sides. And so, I edited a book and I asked afterwards, how was it for you, et cetera? You want feedback? And the author, he said one of the most valuable things was he had a scene in his book that was just unbelievable, like so good. And so I wrote a piece on, okay, this scene is good and it's good because of these things. You can write. It's right here. Take your other scenes and do this. That's your voice. This is your thing. You have this. You're just not applying it. And he couldn't see what was good in his book. Like he couldn't tell that was the best scene in the book. And very technically why it was a good scene. Like why exactly did it work with the right tension and the right conflict and the right goal and everything you need in a scene. And then the author's motivated because they go, okay, I can do this. Yeah, I got to fix all these things. And every single author has trouble with their draft. Like, let's face it, who writes a draft and is great? And, okay, maybe Stephen King, I don't know. But most people, normal people, probably not happening. And so it's a really critical balance for an author to make sure that they're getting feedback that shows them what they're good at. Because every author is good at something. You can find something in every single book that's good.
Right.
And then the writer can then focus on that. And then they want to write because they can see themselves getting better and better.
That's really great. And I love that editing from a place of kindness and the encouragement. I mean, it's like my mom used to always say, it's like go. Because I had this thing when I was growing up where every day my mom would show up to school and my teachers would tell her how talkative I was, how much I misbehaved, all this. And so then one day she just snapped. And she's like, did you do anything good today? It's like every day I show up and you tell me how awful my kid is. And she's like, aren't you guys supposed to be doing, because there was a thing, it's like, aren't you guys supposed to be doing 3 positives to a negative? And kind of like a little feedback sandwich. But it's interesting how that even translates into the editing world, where the giving positive feedback so that people know what they're doing well and can do more of it. In tandem with saying, here's a part that needs to be cut, or this is or the story's dragging, or whatever the feedback that's given elsewhere.
Well, and even stuff like the story's dragging, that's really vague. Like, what does an author do with that, right? Like, oh, okay, great. But if you say the story is dragging because there are 3 paragraphs of backstory right here, and of this backstory, points A and B are important. And you could put one at the beginning and one intersperse them a little bit separate. And this backstory you need to know as an author, but the writer doesn't need, or the reader doesn't need to know it. You're really specific of why. And then the writer's motivated to fix it because they get what it is. Vague advice is really hard to deal with. And I learned this from my very first editor who said, you need to make your protagonist more likable. And you think, I like her. Okay. I don't know. Right. Yeah. It's not helpful. It's just telling me. And then you think, okay, don't know how to do this, right? And you're demotivated. But the kindness comes in that little bit of extra work to say exactly why it's dragging and how, here's some hints on how to fix it.
Hmm. That's really good. You're talented. Where did you learn all of this?
Oh, years and years of research, Chandler, like so much. And I have a really wide background. I mean, I have a techie background and a degree in mathematics, and but then I switched to writing, and in part of that, for 6 years, I was an HR director at a ski resort. And there you deal with
Give
many
feedback.
issues, and you have to give
Yeah.
feedback continually to people to
Hmm.
help them. And they're all 18 to 22. So they need guidance. And so I learned a ton there on how to help people just cope and be better at whatever job they had at this ski resort without crushing them. Because it's really easy
Hmm.
to crush a person. You can find all kinds of things wrong with everybody. And it's
Yeah.
easy to do that. It's hard to go, but you're really good at this. Focus.
Hmm. Hmm. That's interesting. Hmm. So if you're in HR, you might have natural skill sets in editing. That's
Compassion.
cool.
It's just compassion.
Passion for helping people and
Yep.
giving good feedback. What talk to me about what are the main differences between editing fiction and editing nonfiction? Like, so I guess two-part question. If there was a if there was a Venn diagram pie chart, how much overlap is there? And then in the parts that are different, what's different?
Right. Okay. So there you got to go along the scale of fiction to nonfiction. And in the middle is creative nonfiction, which is much closer to fiction. So if you think of Moneyball, it's a good example, right? Great book. It's creative nonfiction. It's a true story written in the format of a story. So it's nonfiction, but it's written in story format. There's memoirs, and they fit into two categories. Those that are creative memoirs, so it's a story. It's meant to be read as a novel, but it's true. And then there's memoirs that are factual. It's meant to be an account of somebody's life. It's not written in story format, so there's not a story arc, that sort of thing. So that's the first distinction to make. So there's a gray line between fiction and nonfiction anyway, there. When you're editing if you want your nonfiction book to be popular, right, you still need to do things like entry and exit hooks into every chapter. Why is the reader reading this chapter, and why do they want to read the next chapter? You still need to have tension in there of what keeps the reader reading, of here's your problem, what pain point are you trying to fix, maybe here's an example. So there are similarities in that respect, that you still in nonfiction, you want to make sure you're solving somebody's problem is usually a big reason for writing nonfiction. And then doing it in a way that's fully engaging. And that's where story can come into play with that book. Now, when you're writing like a math text, okay, well, that's way over here on the extreme end of nonfiction, that there's really not that much in common. When you're editing it, typically a fiction editor is an expert in story. If they're an expert in copy editing of fiction, because copy editing of nonfiction is very different. If you're copy editing a newspaper article, for example, your dialogue is going to be, "I will do this," and in a novel, it's going to be, "I'll do it," or there'll be contractions. It's very different, and so even in copy editing, when you're going fiction to nonfiction, there's quite a big difference. The thing that's similar is that you need to figure out a structure for your nonfiction book.
Mm-hmm.
Fiction, there is a structure that's followed, that's worked across time, and it's the story arc.
Got it.
Nonfiction, not as much, right? It's a little more subjective and up to the author and the topic.
Mm-hmm. Do you recommend people find and work with an editor that is specific to their genre? So nonfiction, fiction, and then even more so, is it a nice to have, or is it a have to have, that like, okay, this is a fiction editor that's experienced with murder mysteries or with thrillers, right, or with like, what's kind of your best advice on that?
So there, you're not going to use the same editor for fiction and nonfiction. Typically, they're two different people. Some people do both, in which case you want to find that. But if someone's strictly a nonfiction editor, you don't want them editing your fiction. Or if someone's strictly a fiction editor, they shouldn't be editing your nonfiction. It's the wrong match. Genres, it depends on the level of editing. So if you're doing a very specific edit to make sure you're meeting all the tropes of fantasy novel, etc., you probably want that person who's expert in fantasy. If you're at the level where you're trying to figure out, do you have a story? You can hire someone who's expert in story. And the one thing I will say is hire a trained editor. Lots of people put up their hand to say, I've written a bunch of books, so I can edit. And that's just not true. That to really understand story, it's complex, it's hard. There are forms that work and forms that don't work. And an editor, usually I tell people when you're hiring an editor, ask them if they're going to draw your story arc for fiction. If the answer is no, move on. Find somebody who will, because that's the very first question an editor should be telling you for a fiction book is, do you have a story? Yes or no. And they can't do it without the story arc. And so it's a very easy way to see if someone's trained in story. And if they are, great. And if they're not, probably not what you need. And I came to that conclusion after meeting so many writers who said, well, I've had this edit. And you think, yeah, you didn't. You had a copy edit. That is not a story edit. Story edit answers this question first and foremost.
That's really, really great advice. So now we know a little bit more on how to find this person, or sorry, what we're looking for in this person. How do you find this person? How do you find a good editor? Where are some places that you recommend?
Well, of course, I'm going to recommend the Fictionary community because that's our goal of the Fictionary community. So we train editors. We have a program called the Fictionary Certified Story Coach Program, and editors have to edit a full novel for us. And to pass the course, we've got an 80% pass rate in it. And we're really looking for people who understand story. They're fully trained in it. And then we hire them out through Fictionary first so that they get practice and we supervise it. And then they go out on their own to edit. There's also, StoryGrid has editors that are fully trained. Readsy's another place you can find editors online, and you can look at their resume and see what they have, and what books they've edited is also listed there. There's a ton of, those are really kind of the top three that where I would go look. I know people personally, so it's much easier for me. You can also ask your writer friends, like, hey, who did you use as your editor, and did you like them?
Yeah. Referrals and marketplaces. That's what, that's what we always talk about is those are kind of the two big channels.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about Fictionary. What is it and how does it help authors write better books?
All right. So Fictionary is my thing. I developed it personally. Not the code that's there now, but the whole structure of it. And I built Fictionary because I needed it. I had my publisher at the time, I had 3 books going, and I was really struggling with story editing. And so what I did is I created a whole crazy thing of spreadsheets to fill in every story element and draw my story arc, my word count per scene. And then I got into Python and figured out, well, how do I pull out my character names? And then I thought, okay, well, now this is silly. We need an app. Let's build this thing. It kind of grew on its own. And so what it's designed to do is, when it went from that to an actual packaged software, it's, forget the spreadsheet stuff, all of that stuff. We have professional developers who've built this thing. And basically what happens is a writer imports their manuscript, software scans it, it organizes it into chapters and scenes. It breaks out how many scenes per chapter. It shows a word count per scene, so you can see the structure of a novel. Draws a story arc, huge thing for a writer. Then it pulls out all the characters, it links them to scenes. And so what it enables a writer to do is using 38 Fictionary story elements, which are the key story elements for every scene. You evaluate your scene, you revise it, and then you watch your story arc and your word count per scene and your characters per scene all redraw to see if you've got your balance right. Is there a story or not? We help write with the blurb and the synopsis that pulls automatically out of the story, so a writer can have a synopsis, not for the purpose of giving it to an agent, for the purpose of seeing if they have a story. So they know what's in their key scenes, like what are their story arc scenes, what's happening in those scenes. These are the key events. And when you see it just written out in 5 sentences, you're like, oh, that's not my story. Whoops, got to fix that. And so it's really designed. We have an extensive in-app library of help and videos that while so for example, if you're working on point of view, but you don't really know what point of view means, you just click a button and this is point of view. This is how you use it in your scene. This is what you're looking for. These are the pitfalls. And so it's designed to teach a writer really how to edit their own book and really understand story so that by the end of it, their story is just better than when they started.
Got it. That's cool. And it was interesting to see, like, on the website, the linking to character scenes. So it's like clicking back and forth between when characters appear. The word count per scene was interesting. So you can see, hey, which scenes are kind of longer, shorter,
Yep.
etc. And
well, that one there is very interesting because what happens when you have a big Word document, you can't see it. It's just 80,000 words scrolling by. But when it's visually in your place and you go, wow, all my scenes are about 1,000 words and that one's 5,000? What was I doing there? Or, one book that we looked at, there was 17 scenes in a chapter, but 2 or 3 in every other chapter. And you think, what is that chapter? That's just weird. And the balance doesn't feel right. When a reader's reading it, they're like, when is this chapter going to end? But the writer can't see it unless it's like, here, fix that scene right here. Like, it's really, really clear when you can see it drawn out for you.
Got it. Now, is Fictionary, is it mostly for fiction authors? Is it helpful for nonfiction as well? Or who's the best fit to use it?
It's designed for novels.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so, we are all fiction, all in.
Cool. Awesome. That's great. Well, I guess a couple final questions is, I would say, Kristina, kind of knowing what you know now, what would be your parting piece of advice for the Kristina from years ago before you wrote your first book and learned all this stuff about editing? And for, let's say, that fiction author who's thinking about or about to write their first fiction novel?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think I would say, there's the thing, write what you know. I kind of think it's write what you love. So you spend a lot of time, and particularly with your first novel, you're with it an awful lot. And so you better love the topic. And so, my first book is a murder mystery in a ski resort. And I'm an avid skier, and I was living in a ski resort. And I wrote a book at a murder mystery on a sailboat, and I lived on a sailboat for 9 years and sailed around the Caribbean. And so I have a lot of experience there, and I love it. And when I moved from the ski resort, I wrote the ski resort books because I kind of miss living in a ski resort, right? And you think, I love that. So I wrote about it. And when I moved from the boat back to land, it was, okay, I have a lot of knowledge on that. So I know it, but it's also something I'm really passionate about. And so then you incorporate your fiction into what it is. Some people, they love history. And so you write a historical novel, or, the thriller is their thing. And so they write thrillers. So it's really find something you're passionate about and write that, because you're going to be with it for years. You better love it.
No doubt. That's great. Kristina, this has been awesome. Where can people go to find out more about you, your books, and Fictionary?
So our website is fictionary.co, not .com, .co. And everything is there. So our community is there, our certification training is there, my books are there. It's the center of my universe.
Awesome. Fictionary, check it out. Kristina, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandler. That was really fun.
Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of the Self-Publishing School podcast. I know there's so many places that you can be spending your time. There's other podcasts that you could be listening to, YouTube channels that you could be watching. So thank you so much. It means the world. Now, I want you to do 3 things right now if you found this episode helpful. All right, number 1, I don't know if you know this, but we've got a YouTube channel. It's a companion channel to this podcast. All the video versions of the episode are on the YouTube channel. So number 1, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Number 2, if you're listening to this podcast wherever, whether this is Spotify, Apple Podcasts, number 2, I want you to subscribe to this podcast right now so you don't miss a future episode. And then number 3, this is probably the most important, leave a review on the podcast. All right, reviews are super important and help this podcast get discovered by other people. So number 3, leave a review on the podcast. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next episode. If you're on the fence about scheduling a publishing consultation call with my team, maybe you're not quite ready for that, I've got some free training that I think will be really helpful for you. All right, all you have to do is go to register to sign up. Go to selfpublishing.com/free training. When you do, you're also going to get a free digital copy of my new book, Published. And on that training, you're going to learn the next steps of how to implement with your book. So how to write, how to publish, how to launch successfully. So go to register right now at selfpublishing.com/free training. I'll see you there.